I'll give a little introduction of who will be participating. The discussion will be moderated by Jeanine Ramirez. Jeanine Ramirez joined New York One News in October 1996. She is a native Brooklynite and the network's Brooklyn reporter, primarily responsible for covering the borough's 2.5 million people, as well as its schools, politics, religions, and neighborhoods. She also is the lead reporter on many Latino issues. She may also be seen on the anchor desk and out in the field reporting breaking news. She's received numerous recognitions for her work, including awards from New York Press Club, City and State, El Diario La Prensa, former Brooklyn Borough President Marty Markowitz, and many more. Joining Jeanine will be Jake Dobkin, the co-founder of the Gothamist network of sites, including Gothamist.com, the popular New York City news, arts, and food blog. In March 2017, he sold Gothamist to DNA.info, who shut it down in November after a labor dispute. Subsequently, with the help of generous donors, he organized a deal to sell the Gothamist sites to public radio stations in New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. for relaunch this spring. Tom Robbins is also joining us. He's been a columnist and staff writer at The Village Voice, the New York Daily News, and the New York Observer. He is an investigative journalist in residence at the CUNY Graduate Center of Journalism and a contributing writer for the Marshall Project. And we also have the pleasure to have speaking tonight Liena Zagare, the publisher and editor at Bklyner, a Brooklyn-wide news site with roots in community reporting. Seeing what unfettered development can do to cities led her to pursue a degree in urban planning from NYU and start the Ditmas Park blog in 2007, one of the earliest online neighborhood news sites in the city, covering the bit of Flatbush where she had settled with her family in 2005. After selling the sites to AOL, Liena briefly worked for Patch, leaving in 2012 to start Corner Media to provide neighbors with community news through Ditmas Park Corner and its sister sites in a manner that would serve the needs of the neighborhoods best. They have all since become Bklyner.com. Join me in welcoming them.
Hi, I'm Jeanine. I'm with New York One. We're going to start with so many changes, right, in this media landscape we're talking about. Last week, it was announced last week that AT&T and Time Warner struck a deal, right, $85 million. That led to Comcast offering $65 billion in cash to buy Fox. There's just this battle for media dominance happening right now, and we see it on our level as well. It's playing out at this local level, and for instance, Sinclair Broadcasting is now buying WPIX, Channel 11 here in New York City. So we're all going to feel this impact of these major media companies and the impact on local news. So I want to talk about that. I'll start with New York One. New York One used to be owned by Time Warner Cable, and it was set up by Time Warner Cable as a subscriber service. So it was set up as a community service in a way to kind of retain cable subscribers, 24-hour news, New York City news, and you could only get it if you subscribe to Time Warner Cable. So it was a retention tool. Then we got bought out by Charter Communications, which based in Ohio and Connecticut, and they came in and they're doing news now, and they never did news before, and so they took over the cable system, and they are, redoing our station. You see more promos on the street. You see new sets. They put a lot of money into New York One, and they're opening an LA station that's similar to New York One, modeled after that, a 24-hour station, and they have stations across the country. So we're in flux right now, too. And we became the news at one point. We became the news when Charter came in and let go maybe about half of our staff. So it was weird to pick up the Daily News and to see news, my friends, my colleagues, my news station in the Daily News or in any of the publications here saying who got axed at New York One. And they got rid of our entire sports department. And so now what we do for sports, we have nobody doing sports. When we used to cover everything, every locker room, every, pre-game, post-game for local teams, now what they do is they contract out with SNY which is Sports New York, which does the Mets. And so we contract out with them, and Sports NY Daily gives us, sort of like a roundabout, like a roundup of New York City news, and we just kind of run the we turn to and then we go to our SNY partner for what's happening in New York sports. So that's what's kind of happening. We're dissolving some things and making way for other things, and it seems to be a lot of cost-cutting measures, and so we're experiencing it now as well, and we never did before because we're always on the Time Warner cable. And for the better or for worse, there's both sides. They put a lot of money into our sets. They spent a lot of money, their new makeup and hair and consultants, to make us all look great. While before we just kind of just looked like we looked, right? It wasn't so flashy. So we're in the middle of change, and we can all speak to change. So let's start with Jake, who again started with Gothamist, right?
Yeah, I've seen some stuff the last couple of years. Scary stuff. Yeah, I mean, you heard it in my bio. Like, basically, starting in about 2 years ago, I started to feel like the future was going to get a little choppy in local news, especially with advertising, Google and Facebook taking everything over. You may have heard Gawker went under in one single lawsuit, took out a company 10 times the size of mine. So that fall, 2016, I started looking for a life preserver, somebody with more resources than me to be able to, help us pilot through those choppy times. And I did actually find someone, the owner of DNA.info, which was, you guys know what DNA.info is, right? Yeah, a very well-regarded local website. And my plan was basically to merge the two sites, make something more powerful than the sum. And that would have gone really, really well, except that I neglected to anticipate one thing, which was that our staff was about to unionize, which they did. And unfortunately, the owner of DNA.info, though he had never involved himself in the politics of the site, never intervened in the editorial, fortunately, he had quite a hang-up about unions. And after 6 months of trying to basically diffuse the situation, keep everybody employed, my time ran out, and the unionists called a vote. They won 27-2, and a week later, like to the hour, the owner pulled out and shut it down. And that was a very, very scary and very, very sad moment for a lot of people. It was not just New York. Gothamist had 5 other sites. We had altogether 150 people working for us. So everybody got fired. Luckily, we were able to work together to work out a severance package. Everybody ended up getting 4 months, which is good. And during those 4 months, I used the time to arrange a sale to New York Public Radio of the Gothamist assets. That story would take me like 20 minutes to tell you, but luckily it worked out pretty good. And now a majority of the people that used to work for Gothamist are now working for New York Public Radio, WNYC, running the site again. And God willing, more of them will be working with us soon. So it kind of had a happy ending. And, to me, it sort of reflects the arc of what's happened in the last 2 years, the collapse of commercial media, especially commercial local media, and the rise of non-for-profit media, especially non-for-profit local media. Thank you.
Me? So I come to journalism from a community activist perspective. That's how I started, getting crosswalks and stoplights. And I built my little team up from the scratch, one neighborhood at a time, and now they're all in one big network called Bklyner. So it's still neighborhood reporting, but it's Brooklyn-wide. And much like Jake and Gothamist, we found that the advertising business that we had built up with the small businesses, the local pizza places and bars and restaurants, a lot of that went to Facebook when Facebook monetized. And, there's no way to compete. with that kind of targeting for a local news operation. So when we were looking at our numbers last fall, we were like thinking that maybe this just did not make sense. And then we reached out to our readers and launched a subscription drive, and we're still in business. So hopefully we'll be in business for a little longer. And that's my change story.
I don't know. I've been to a lot of funerals in the journalism business, and I've seen more people come and go in 30 or more years, and none of it's been good. But I do think that, given the fact that we've all migrated now into cyberspace and its infinite possibilities, there's a real possibility for a true democratic change in the way news can both be produced and distributed and owned. We're not there yet. I worked at one point in the 80s at the Village Voice when there was a office that took classified ads, that there would be a line into the street to buy an ad for your apartment, for your business, to find a girlfriend, and the paper was literally so thick you could not fold it in half and tuck it under your arm. I mean, they made so much. The Village Voice was at that point, its own worst enemy because of the fact that it threw off so much money. It attracted big names who then proceeded to spread it across the country. They bought other papers. They took on a lot of debt, and they found themselves owned by folks who were much more interested in the revenue than they were in the journalism, which is par for the course. But one of the things that was extraordinary was I did my second tour. I left and went to the Daily News and was there for about a dozen years. And actually, when I got there, they had their Sunday circulation was about 1.2 million. And by the time I left, it was half that. I was personally responsible for the loss of most of that readership. And I went back to The Voice for a bunch of reasons. But by the time when I went back in 2000, it was still a very healthy publication. It was doing very well. Throwing off, I got a hold of one profit and loss sheet. We had a union, which was very active and did a great job advocating on behalf of people. And we found a profit and loss sheet which showed that they were making 20% profit at that time. I thought, that's pretty good. I wouldn't mind making 20% profit. That faded away. That pretty much disappeared in a matter of time. And ironically, I was just talking to Jake about this before we came up here. So one of the biggest single reasons, so that shop on the ground floor on Cooper Square where they used to line up and bring the ads, like all those ads disappeared because there was a guy named Craig Newmark who came up with the idea of you don't have to pay for this, I'll put it online for free and you can have this, instant recognition of where things are going. Well, last week, Craig Newmark gave $20 million to the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, where I now work, and I now work for the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. So, go figure, right? I mean, this is, the world is round. There's a lot of different permutations. I have really strong feelings about this subject because I believe that, as I tell the students at the school, being a reporter is the greatest single job you can have. You can get paid to talk to people, and you don't have to sell them anything. You just hear their stories, and everybody's got a marvelous story. But it's really clear that we are losing a lot of that stuff on the ground in a lot of different places. A lot of those stories just aren't getting told. So with that dire note, I'll pass it back to Jeanine.
Well, at New York One, part of our rebrand is also this around the boroughs, what's happening around the boroughs, and we try to keep our beats and our boroughs, and we have we have a beat reporter for each borough. I think we're one of the few people who still has one of the few outlets that still has a transit reporter. So what he does is grab the camera and go on the train every single day and find his story. We have an education, so we're kind of built like a newspaper and a 24-hour, like a 10-10 wins or something, where it's like we repeat all day long, and we try to keep these beats to kind of cover New York City as much as possible. But again, we are changing, so we're trying to do more live. I guess it's like more of an engage of the audience. We're trying to do more live stuff and less repetitive. So the landscape is changing, and I don't know if how about in your situations, is local news being covered like it once was? Do you think if DNA.info is not here, like who's covering that beat?
DNA.info is a difficult thing to replace because it had, at least in New York, almost 30 journalists, spread out by neighborhood. Unfortunately, DNA.info was also losing a lot of money, which is one of the reasons that they wanted to merge with Gothamist, because Gothamist was profitable. So they thought maybe I would be able to combine everything and make a profit out of it. Do I think that all local news is disappearing? No, because I every day I go into WNYC and they've got dozens and dozens of local journalists working really hard. And mostly their output goes to the radio, but and yes, they are not, they do not have local offices in each borough, but they're working very hard. And now combined with Gothamist, it's the idea that I originally had with DNA.info makes a lot more sense with WNYC, right? You combine Gothamist's swiftness and appeal to young people with the strong journalism chops of WNYC, and you get something better. And we're actually starting to see that happen. If you look at the site, the quality of journalism that is on Gothamist, the quality of local journalism has really risen, even over the last 7 weeks that we've been reopened.
And Liena, is yours only on the web, or do you think about doing a podcast, or is it where do you go from where you are?
I think we stay on the web for the foreseeable future because it's easy, and that's also easy to find. And I wish I was in a position to diversify the offerings and do a podcast or do video, we sometimes do live video streams on Facebook if there's something breaking. That said, going to the question about the local news, I just think there's too few reporters around. When we go, and I have 3, so it's not like there's a lot of us, but we don't see anybody else at the community meetings. We do not see anybody else at the police precinct meetings. And with my stuff, I can't have somebody at every meeting either. There's 17 community boards in Brooklyn, and it's add to that the school boards, and there's a lot of meetings that are not getting covered at all. And there are a lot of issues that demand attention, whether it's the education reform that's proposed, or speed cameras that you were covering this morning, and my guys couldn't be there because you pick and choose. It's,
what gets covered and what doesn't, right? And what is your perspective? Because you worked at the Daily News when there were a lot of reporters covering.
Yeah, they had borough offices everywhere, but I think we had a couple of people on Staten Island. So one of the projects I got to do when I was at CUNY Journalism School was I got a small grant from a foundation which was deeply concerned about exactly this question. It was about the demise of local journalism. And it was interesting why this foundation cared, because they mainly supported local non-for-profits. But they recognized that there was a direct correlation between the success of the folks who are in the trenches and who are doing good deeds and doing good work, and the ability to get it covered, and to have that, one fed the other, that there was an integral connection between having local coverage and just good government, good neighborhood work that would get reported what was going on. So they gave me this grant, and one of the things that I did was I gave a grant to a guy named Paul Moses, who is a former City Hall bureau chief and editor at Newsday, and who then had been, since retired, as a journalism professor at Brooklyn College. And I just said, if you can take some of your students and maybe go out and try to measure, what's been lost and what's there now. And one of the things that had prompted this was I was working on a story about criminal justice in Queens. And I had gone across the street to the courthouse there, and found that the press room was locked. And that was sort of like my starting point with Paul, was like, because I knew that Paul had used to work in that press office, that once upon a time he had covered it. And he was aghast to hear that because, look, Queens, I know none of you ever go there, right? And I know it's, it's still like, the second biggest borough. It still is like, the most diverse borough in the city. There is a lot of stuff happening, good and bad, in Queens, and a lot in their courts. And think of that, like there's nobody in there that was locked. So we gave this grant to Paul, and Paul wrote this piece, and he sort of like tried to figure out, like, well, one thing he did was he counted the daily stories on local coverage in the New York Times. He took like 1 week in 2000, and he counted over 100 that were in 1 week's worth, and then he went back and he counted this was 2017, and there was a third that number of stories. It had just, the bottom had fallen out. He then went and he tried to survey. DNA.info was then in business. Now, we sort of pointed at that in the story. It's like, well, this is one hopeful sign. Here's an online, cyberspace operation with like really feisty young reporters who like want to run to every fire and run to every crime and like be able to cover it. They seem to be doing a terrific job. And we pointed that as like, if we can like have more DNA infos, maybe the world could get better. I mean, one of the points that Paul made in his story that I think bear repeating is that he said, like, what's happening in terms of journalism coverage in New York and probably in other big cities is like it's a version of climate change, which is that we're doing a pretty good job still of covering City Hall. Right? If you read the Daily News, if you watch New York One, if you read the New York Times, you'll see that there's some pretty good stories, digging away at this left-wing mayor with 2 left feet that we've got, and that they're really on his case all the time. But on the fringes, out there in the boroughs, the area that Liena is trying to cover and that Jake's Gothamist is now trying to do again, there's very little going on. Like that's sort of the waters of the melting ice cap are sort of lapping up at the edges, and that's where I think we worry. And then he quoted an odd guy in his story for like, in terms of like, try to get the bigger picture, this John Oliver, where is he from? Australia? What is his name? Where is he?
England.
Huh? Where?
England.
He's a Brit. See this? Okay. So John Oliver made the point that the media is a food chain, without which it falls apart without local newspapers. And it's really true. I mean, you know how you feel about that, Jeanine, in terms of like making up the stories that you're going to do every day. But traditionally, assignment editors at the radio stations, at the TV stations, at even the bigger papers would like figure, what's in the dailies? What are the dailies doing? Like they're telling us what's important, what we need to go out, and you're going to be able to do something that the dailies at that point could never do, which was put a face and a voice to it, which was much more exciting than anything I could put on a page with a written word. But that's part of the food chain. So those are two of the things I think that are sort of like, we run the risk of losing. I would come back, I'd like to talk about that nonprofit thing that Jake mentioned a minute ago and some other stuff that's going on, but let me pass it back to Jake.
I can see like how, just in the 15 years I've been doing this, how, gathering news for Gothamist has changed, because in the beginning, the base level of our aggregation was the newspapers. That's where we got, the half of Gothamist content, we try to be original, half is aggregated. That was where the aggregation came from. Over the years, we added to that neighborhood blogs, and for a while, it was like this efflorescence of neighborhood blogs. There were so many, and they covered neighborhoods really, really well. Like if the neighborhood had a blog, you were pretty solid on what was going on there. But then, over time, social media really replaced blogging, and now, to do what we do, Gothamist generates probably right now about 80 stories, and when we get back up to speed, maybe 130 stories a week. We have to get a lot of our information from social media, which has much less even coverage of neighborhoods. We do what we can with community newspapers, with what's left at the Times and the Post and the Daily News, but it's we are aware that that base layer that Gothamist depends on, and I think to some extent a lot of media companies depend on is gone, and we're like trying to hopefully come up with a replacement, where our outlets can contribute some of the original stuff, that base level stuff, right? Each outlet can do a little bit more of that, and somehow all together we'll form an ecosystem. I don't know if it'll be as good as it was, but it's going to have to be good, because otherwise our New York City democracy is in serious trouble.
Now, Liena, you talked about Facebook. Sometimes you stream live on Facebook. Now, is Facebook a legitimate news source? Like, there's that question, right? Like,
I mean, I think Facebook is as legitimate a news source as, as the street. You kind of assess who you see and who you're talking to. And to that extent, I think it's, I think you kind of have to evaluate each individual statement. I don't think there's a blanket statement that you can make about it. I mean, is street a legit news source?
I'll make one. Facebook is a cancer. So is all social media. Twitter should be probably like locked down and then, shut down. Like the benefit that I personally receive, which is like they send traffic to our websites, right? And for many years, that outweighed the obvious social costs, right? But over time, especially in the time that I've been, we were shut down, it's like they dialed that traffic they send out basically down to zero. So they have essentially no social, good purpose. It's all just like Russian trolls.
I am totally
scammers,
going to object to this statement.
And, it's terrible. And not only is it terrible business-wise, it's terrible spiritually. Everyone who is on Twitter and Facebook afterwards feels worse, And if it was up to me, they would be completely eliminated, and we would just have to start from scratch with something else, and we would find a way to deliver the news without them, and our lives and our country would be so much better off.
I don't know if the lives would be so much better off, but I do think that it is an absolutely invaluable way of finding information right now, and what is happening in the neighborhoods across Brooklyn, which is what I do. And I've lost count as to how many Facebook groups I belong to, and I do moderate some myself. But it is, it can be awful, but it is also the place where a lot of issues surface, where you notice a lot of stuff that's happening and what people are talking about. And that is, to the extent that I cannot have reporters everywhere, we can cover a lot more ground by being able to see what people are talking about and what is upsetting them, and whether it's garbage or yet the umpteenth traffic accident at this intersection that has been begging for a stop sign forever. That is stuff where we can have immediate impact and help and lift these stories and tell the stories and have a resolution that is a very, very positive one.
Tom, do you want to weigh in?
It's funny. I never look at Facebook. I mean, it's not a point of honor. It's just, I try to avoid this thing that Jake is describing about feeling. But at the same time, look, part of the problem of our business now is the poverty of the language. We've allowed some of the phrase crowdsourcing, what a terrible thing to describe as to going out and asking people what's going on. It's a phrase that basically means turning over to the public the question of tell us your experience with something, but we call it crowdsourcing. And believe it or not, there's people get paid to teach that in courses at journalism schools, how to do it. But what Liena is talking about, I think, is a form of crowdsourcing. It's a form of let's find out what people are putting up on their personal social media page and using some of that in order to be able to report on the news. And you find stuff out because people are reporting things that you wouldn't otherwise hear if you're not there. Right?
I've seen the future here. I'm from Park Slope. Is anybody else from Park Slope in the audience? My wife, we've got kids, and so a few years ago she joined Park Slope Parents, which is the world's most aggressive news group. Literally, a leaf cannot fall in the neighborhood without 10 people having an opinion about it. And but the thing is, Park Slope Parents, I believe you have to join. I think it's a $25, maybe $50 fee a year to be a member. It does all the positive stuff that we were just talking about like Facebook doing, but with none of the negative stuff, because it's moderated heavily by professional moderators, you know? And it's like, wow, like it is so much more reflective of our community than anything that any new, you know, Park Slope group on Facebook would be, or the maniacs on Twitter who like are, you know, sort of represent our neighborhood, you know?
So Jeff Zucker, the president of CNN, says everybody's going to find out what's going on from their phone. So like how do media outlets who are not, you know, or haven't gotten to the digital, you know, level yet, I mean they have to, but how newspapers and everybody else do it? Like I know that in sports, for instance, we eliminated our sports department saying, you know what, the mentality for people who, you know, for businesses who do this, say, well, people are going to get their sports numbers on their phone anyway, right? They're going to know the scores. So they're not looking to television later to find out what the score was because they already know. So it has to be another level. It has to be like a deeper conversation going on, not just the numbers. So what is your reaction to people just not needing so many media outlets? They could just find everything out on their phone.
Well, I think it's obviously driven, you know, outlets towards higher quality. It's certainly, you know, which is part of the reason that I think the future belongs to outlets that have been doing high quality all along, like public television, public radio, other public media companies. Because like the mechanical stuff, a lot of it, like sports scores, is going away. It's being, you know, artificial intelligence out of like existence. But the true telling of stories, like really moving stories, you know, like think about podcasts, right? You know how hard a good podcast is to put together? You know who's really good at making podcasts? People who make public radio, because like this is all they do, tell stories in audio. And now WNYC, they're like the second or third largest podcast publisher in America. They have millions, maybe tens of millions of downloads each month. And like, so this crisis that the phone precipitated actually, I think, was sort of to their benefit, right? That business never would have come to them. We wouldn't have podcasts without the phones. And the flight towards quality really benefits people who are good. You know, I think that's why the Times now is doing pretty well. I assume the Wall Street Journal is doing pretty well. And, you know, in local news, we're going to have to follow kind of the same path. Like, we're not going to be able to cover every community board meeting. That's simply going to be impossible. That'll have to be the provenance of people on our neighborhood, you know, message boards. But we can, like, spot the one community board meeting this week that's really important and that connects with some issue that is citywide, and tell that story really, really well. And hopefully that'll be a story that gets read all around the city. And I know that's not a perfect solution, but that, you know, we're working with what we got here, so.
And talk a little bit about the nonprofits that you wanted to touch on.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a few different models that have evolved from some of the same pressures, which are, you know, there's a lot going on. I've been writing for this one that's focused on criminal justice called the Marshall Project. It's named after Thurgood Marshall, and it's focused on criminal justice issues. It calls itself nonpartisan, and it's everything across the country in terms of prison conditions and prosecutions and wrongful convictions, and you know, it's an interesting phenomenon to watch because they started from zero 4 years ago, right? I mean, they had zilch. They made some very smart hires. They hired the guy who was the former big cheese at the New York Times, a guy named Bill Keller, and he hired a lot of good folks to do reporting there. But it's now sort of eked out this niche, at least among people who are interested in that area, where they do both a morning aggregation, the roll call of like all the top criminal justice stories of the day, and then they do their own work. And so what I've always done, no matter where I've worked, has been, I call it investigative journalism. Sometimes it's called enterprise or long form. It's just, the bottom line was it was stuff that took a long time to do and which took a lot of money to pay me because I'm worth a lot and you got to pay me to do it. I'm not going to do it for nothing. The Marshall Project was able to, they started with a guy who gave them a nest egg, Neil Barsky, who was a former newspaperman himself, and he put some of his money into it. He went out and he found other big bucks people. So they paid me, a fair amount of money to do a long series about conditions in New York State's prisons. So that series ran in the New York Times in a partnership with Marshall Project, and that's happening more and more. You'll see, one thing from various ProPublica, which is the other really largest nonprofit news organization, which is doing this stuff. But the point that's, I think, is really most notable here is that the Times, the great and mighty New York Times, was not going to do that stuff on their own. It only happened because, A, there was an organization which had the interest, and B, they were basically fitting the tab, to do it. I think the Times paid for some of the expenses for me to drive back and forth to Attica, but other than that, they had pretty much of a free ride on that piece. So that, there'd been so many others that have now multiplied in the last just couple of years, and there's more all the time that focus on education. There's the Hechinger report out of Columbia. There's Chalkweed. There's a lot of really good nonprofits. So the problem here is kind of obvious. There's only so many people who are, both have money in their pockets and the goodwill to basically underwrite the cost of this stuff. So now there's something new coming in, which I'm hoping folks here will explain to me, which is based on cryptocurrency. And I think it's fascinating. I don't know if it'll work or not, but they have in the last, right here in New York, launched two really interesting projects, Documented, which is focused just on immigration issues, which is obviously an issue that New Yorkers and Americans are deeply interested in right now, and another one called FAQ NYC, which is going to be sort of across-the-board podcasts. So it's premised on this thing. The one thing I would wish that they would do is just, if they're going to be a journalism organization, hire a reporter to explain what it means, because I have read through their website and I still can't figure out, but Jake's going to tell me right now.
This is called Civil. It's a new, coin offering that will probably launch this summer. And, like all Bitcoin projects, it is incredibly complicated and hard to understand. But basically, one feature it'll have is allow these publications that run on it to have a permanent archive. So their archives can never be deleted or sued out of existence.
Why is that an issue?
It's an issue because guys like Peter Thiel might take objection to a story you have and then sue you to death and then force you to remove the story as a consequence of your bankruptcy. And it actually happens fairly frequently. An interesting kind of corollary, though, is that sometimes you need to remove a story. You got the facts wrong, or if you're an independent publisher, you just can't afford to defend it and don't want to lose the entire organization on one story, so you want to take it down. If everything is permanently archived, maybe you can't do that, and then suddenly, like a big legal problem. And that's the kind of thing you'd only realize if you were somebody who had paid a lot of legal bills.
Did Ricketts try to do the same thing with?
No, the DNA, there's actually kind of a misconception about something that happened the day DNA.info closed. The archives were never going to be deleted. We had multiple copies stored all around the country. Nobody in management, ownership, or in membership wanted to see the archives deleted. We all believed that they were really important. What had happened was kind of a FUBAR situation where the owner wished to put up a message to explain his reasoning for shutting it down, and the message really should have gone up in what we call a modal window, which is a pop-up, but instead it just covered every page. And so for 3 hours, people thought that we had deleted the entire site. And we gave them good reason to, because that was quite a F up. But within a few hours, we had gotten the message out that don't worry, nothing had been deleted. And by the next day, it was back. And as a consequence of the WNYC deal, all of those archives will be permanently preserved by the different public radio stations. So that's important. Civil also has some other stuff. Basically, it offers a content management system to run your new startup. And then it also involves a currency which you can use to pay micropayments for articles. So it's very complicated. There are at least 15 different new startups that are going on top of it. if it works, like the currency gets bought a lot, it'll create money essentially to give some of it. Hopefully, will go to journalists to do their thing. It's all very shadowy. Like it's being sponsored mainly by the guy who founded Ether, which is the second largest cryptocurrency. So should he choose, that guy has billions of dollars worth of Ether, he could just move that money into Civil and then have Civil distribute it to journalists. That would be an incredibly positive thing. I'm not sure that that's how it's going to work. Nobody knows how it's going to work. It's just something that's going on.
All right, so that's the other thing. Like, you get paid. You have journalists on staff. They have to turn. Right? How many stories do your reporters turn in a day? What is expected of them?
2 original ones.
2 original
plus
stories.
Whatever else we can manage.
Right. So sometimes to do a long form investigative piece, it's going to take days, right? You just can't turn, and that requires time. And so the companies say, well, how much time do you need? So that's where you get the underwriting to do a special long form piece. So it's very complicated, but it's like feed the beast, right? The newspapers have to go to print. They have to have so many stories. You have to have so many stories updated. We have to feed a 24-hour news station. So it's a constant fill. Now I'd like to open questions to the audience here. Go ahead.
Yeah. Quite I'm sure.
Michael White, Citizens Defending Libraries and Noticing New York. What I haven't heard talked about a lot is the subject of propaganda and the influence of money. And in this city, particularly, that's real estate. So as the news outlets become less self-supporting and much more affordable, they become acquired like toys. And there are a lot of news outlets that have strong interrelationships with the real estate industry. The Times doesn't publish anything that is really critical of the real estate industry. That's why the Atlantic Yards report started originally as the Times report, as a media watch site. The Alden Capital is dismantling local news around the country. They give instructions, publish corporate press releases as if it were news. That's propaganda.
So what's the question?
So in New York City, let's talk about the unreliability of propaganda when we've got the real estate industry putting out press releases and the difficulty in getting good reporting on the real estate industry and or other situations where, like real estate, there's big money involved.
Anybody cover real estate or?
While you were talking, one of the things I was thinking, probably not that funny, but one of the nice things about the demise of certain of the newspaper titans in New York, like Mort Zuckerman, who used to own the Daily News, is that he's out of the picture now. And there was no question that when he bought the Daily News, he did it because it was good for his bottom real estate line. It was one of the reasons I left there to go back to The Voice, was because of the fact that his financial interest from his real estate company really governed the stories that we were able to do about, at least about the governor and the mayor, a great deal. And I think, look, it's an occupational hazard. I mean, it's one of the things, and that wasn't, he didn't invent it. I mean, this has been going on. I would argue with your line about the New York Times has not had any critical stories about the real estate industry, but put that on the side. I mean, the problem is, again, that in order to do, I used to do the worst landlords every year at the Village Voice, and that was a labor-intensive mission, I can tell you. We spent a long time, climbing tenement stairs and talking to people and trying to get the goods, and in those days you couldn't just, look them up on a computer and find them. You had to go down to the courthouse and be able to dig them out and find the bureaucrats who were hiding them. And that was the antidote to the kind of thing that you're talking about. We have some pretty good real estate coverage now, as near as I can tell. I mean, I don't look at them all the time, but Curbed and what are these other things?
Real Deal.
Real Deal, I mean, they report on the deals and the issues that are going down. The underlying issues, the reason that people get into this game, I think, is to be able to You know, I mean, you don't get into it to get rich and to be able to, like, make friends. You know, you get into it because you're hoping that you're going to make a difference in the world. Is that you need to be able to get into those stories and find out what the real deal is on the stories in the real deal. And that's the thing that takes a great deal of time. And that's what we're up against regardless, you know, in any newspaper. Even if we had, at the Village Voice, the only advertisers who had any weight were the guys who would sell mattresses, and they really didn't care in their futons, you know, like they really didn't have a big, you know, stake in any game. So we were pretty free to be able to write whatever we wanted. That's a very rare situation. You know, we haven't had that. And I don't expect that we're going to have it again. But look, real estate is to New York like oil is to Texas, you know. I mean, it is the one single thing that still continues to motivate. And I would say that, you know, overall there is, yes, a big dearth in terms of telling tough stories about what deals are going on and how they're being made. But, you know, hopefully that's one thing that, like, with the advent of nonprofit journalism more, or maybe this model that Civil is trying to do, we can figure out a way to do more of it.
I mean, I just spent like hours today arguing about a real estate story that had gone on for like weeks over time. You know, it's like one of those things that should have been a week, and then suddenly 8 weeks later you got like reporters digging a 12-foot hole. You know, the great thing about not-for-profit journalism is they answer to no one, maybe not even the people who work with them sometimes, and they would stop at nothing. The idea that like anyone, any industry, any person, even any donor, anything would have any kind of sway with these people is crazy. They wouldn't. They're motivated only by the truth, and that is an incredibly valuable thing to have. Because, I mean, I never pulled the story because an advertiser asked at Gothamist, but you know, like, what if like a big campaign, 20% of our yearly budget, what if that advertiser asked for something? I mean, they never did, but like, what if they had? Like, if it meant the jobs of 5 people, like, what would I have done? I don't know. I'm a pragmatist. Like, so I'm glad that I'm in the non-for-profit game now because I don't have to make decisions like that or worry about them.
Another question. And Sinclair is going to be interesting when they take over PIX because they are like a propaganda machine, and I don't know how much they're going to change.
Yeah.
You know, we'll see how that plays out. Okay, good.
I'd like to ask Liena if you've ever felt, do you get any pressure from local businesses about coverage of whatever they're up to? And I'm also curious to know, question 2, is do you feel you have any clout with the elected officials when you have stories that are important to the borough?
To the first one, yes. I mean, we get the press releases, and you know, the more money they have, the more resources they have to put the word out. But also, I tend to direct them to our advertising business and say, well, we offer sponsored content too, so take that, and you will be supporting reporting with that. So that usually works. We do prioritize original reporting over everything else, and we are really short-staffed, so it's not usually a hard decision. Regarding local politicians, I think it varies a lot, and there are some that are, generally the ones that serve their communities well are very responsive. It's almost one-to-one.
You know, she's not telling the story on herself, but I've told it a couple of times. And the Bklyner, when a new precinct commander got appointed a year ago, in pardon? 2 years ago, in the Bensonhurst Bay Ridge area, usually a local outlet, you know, online or printed, they're going to do their best to like curry favor with the new precinct commander because that's where local interest is with local crime. You're going to bring the guy, you know, a plate of fudge or brownies or something to like ingratiate yourself with them. I mean, that's what reporters do, you know, you just kiss ass with the local, whoever the top cop is. So this lady, like, instead of doing that, the guy gets the job, and she looks at him, and she looks at the name, and the miracle of the internet, she realizes that this was one of the cops who was most aggressive during Occupy Wall Street. And in fact, there are photographs which she then promptly ran on the front of her website showing this cop putting somebody up against the wall like that. So let's just say it didn't exactly ingratiate her with being able to get stories. I mean, that completely goes against the grain of what you are supposed to do in terms of, it's not quite a business, but it's almost a business because getting cop stories is important to the business of doing stories. So
They could be a good source of information, right? So,
tell us.
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, there are times where you have to work your sources. And so in order to work your sources and find out information that nobody else has, they'll tell you something off the record and you'll follow up somewhere else. So yeah, you have to have a good relationship with these people. So putting them on the front, on the front of your website sometimes, you have to kind of decide what's best for your viewers, for your readers, for journalism. Is it getting the next crime story through a source, or is it actually putting this guy up because he's the most aggressive guy? So you have to weigh that.
Was there any feedback?
He's now at a different precinct.
She drove him out of town.
Other questions? Yeah.
I wanted to expand a little about the question of government, because there's been a lot of aggression against the press by elected officials on many levels, unfortunately. And, as I think, we all agree, the press is essential for keeping government honest and elected officials honest. So I wonder if you find that there's a big difference in how various elected officials respond. There seems to be this belief that they can just go on the internet and ignore the press and stuff like that. So I'm just curious your perception on those kind of issues.
I've noticed that one more thing I hate about social media is the disintermediation effect that obviously our president has harnessed so well, right? You can just type it out and nobody, by the time the reporters have the story, he's already tweeted 5 other crazy things. That actually happens on the local level. De Blasio is actually famously hostile to the press, wishes also to try to control the narrative, does not do it anywhere near as aptly. But yeah, in general, the contempt in which the press is held, and to be honest, reporters have always been held in contempt by anyone in power. I mean, their jobs are to make the people in power crazy or get them arrested. So of course, there isn't a lot of love between these two groups. But the people in power, not just the government people, but the rich, they know what time it is. They know what's going on. They know the forces that are contributing here, and they know that the press is going through a weak period and that they have other options, right, through social media, and none of that is helpful for our democracy.
But I think it's always been a love-hate relationship, right? Because they want to get in front of the camera. For television, they all want to be in front of the camera. But at the same time, they want to control the narrative. But then when you control the narrative, then they want to run away from the camera. So there's always there's always a push and pull. And they know that, and we know that. So, you're nice to them, but at the same time, you have to get your story. So, if they don't look great at the end of the story, then, so be it. Any other questions?
This is a question for Jake Dobkin. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your deal with WNYC and whether you see it as a generic model in any way for other partnerships with public radio stations, because it seems from a distance it's clear what the advantages, positive advantages were for you and your colleagues at the Gothamist, finding a new home for the people who lost their jobs, reconnecting with your former audience and keeping the archives alive and all the rest of it. It seems, to me anyway, less clear what the advantages were from WNYC's viewpoint if they had been given the option of taking the donors' money which financed this and just said you can use it to hire more people and improve your website and the rest of that. Why would that not have been a more optimal outcome for
one thing that was attractive,
marriage with the Gothamist?
One thing that was attractive about the deal was that I had raised the money to move the assets.
So you brought the money to the table.
Yeah, so the money was not going to just be donated. It didn't come from WNYC sources that would have been otherwise spent on WNYC programming. It came with Gothamist, so that made it a little bit easier. The advantages of the deal from their point of view are that Gothamist has a large digital, generally younger audience. Public radio's audience all around the country is aging, and we've seen what happens with the newspaper. Suddenly you can hit a very problematic point if you're not constantly bringing in younger people. So the advantage of having Gothamist is that, kind of at a stroke, they quadrupled or quintupled their digital youth audience in New York City, and did it in a fairly lightweight, cost-friendly way, because Gothamist also brings with it its ad sales. We raised $200,000 in the world's most successful journalism Kickstarter of all time, except for one in Luxembourg. And so there are a lot of advantages to them. I mean, essentially what they want to do is add a third leg to the tripod, right? They've got podcasts now, which are really going well. They are incredibly strong in radio, and if they could have digital as a third leg to the non-for-profit business, that would be very, very good. Now, this is not a simple operation, right? As I saw at DNA.info, we're going to have, it's going to take months or maybe even years before we know, how it worked, to what extent it works, what does Gothamist look like under public radio? How does it change? But I mean, the people that I've been working with the last, 5 or 6 months are just great, and they're so devoted to the cause of journalism and saving our democracy and making this world a better place, that even on days where I'm like, oh my God, there are 10 things that I don't understand or can't fix right now. It is a very nice place to work.
Another question? I'm going to go in the front.
Hi. What I was thinking about, because of this panel, is how local news has the advantage of credibility, whereas, people may feel about national news that it's fake news, or they may sort of buy that line. Their relationship to local news is different, and because they can see the stoplight on the corner was or wasn't put in, So I wanted to ask how explicitly you take that mission, that ability to sort of bring credibility and sort of bring an audience to believe that your reporters are telling the truth, into things like endorsements, political endorsements or editorials, or if you, I guess I'm asking Jake and Liena particularly, if you think strategically. It's not so much a journalistic thing, but it is an editorial thing about how to take that audience and influence them on national issues and influence them on political issues. Did I make myself clear?
Yes. That's a very good question, and we've never endorsed anybody, partly because we started out as neighborhood news sites, and everything's always more complicated the more you know about it. And now that we've sort of took one step up, I am incredibly tempted to make a couple of endorsements. But it is, again, it would still be Brooklyn local level, but it's, this is one where I wish I had more time and I could do what the New York Times does, where you sit down with each candidate and have a proper interview. And, I think until I can do that properly, my personal views probably should not influence what I recommend, because that would affect the credibility, I think, more than anything else.
I'll just speak to the business side. There were, even at Gothamist, which was an independent company, there was a very strong Chinese wall between we would take political advertisements, but they could never influence our coverage in the same way no business could influence our coverage. In terms of endorsements, there were a couple of times where our very young, extremely enthusiastically political staff wanted to endorse somebody, let's call him Bernie Sanders, and an equally strong faction wanted to endorse Hillary Clinton, and like eventually I had to just like be like, nobody's endorsing anyone, like we just need to like cover local news. You know, you can cover like how this affects New York, but like we can't waste our time arguing about this because it's becoming a huge fight in the office. At public media, they're incredibly nonpartisan and take it extremely seriously, not taking political positions and not having the coverage influenced by the political leanings of the reporters. And I've seen it come up in many, many meetings, and every time it comes up, like where there's an opportunity to shade it a little bit, or maybe like, you know, like Gothamists like might, you know, like sneak in a word like in our titles implying that Donald Trump is insane, you know, like they do not do that. They always err on the side of like, you know, protect the seriousness of the journalism, and it's very impressive.
I've been covering Brooklyn. I was hired as a Brooklyn reporter, and New York One has traditionally just tried to find New Yorkers doing New York news, you know, told by New Yorkers. So when I was asked to cover Brooklyn, I'm born and raised in Brooklyn. I went to Brooklyn schools. I live in Brooklyn still. So like that credibility part, I think is very important, because I think that when I report on Brooklyn, it's somebody who like was born and raised here, and you know, and I think it is. You know, my parents are still here, and so I have my kids here. And they go to public schools, so yeah, so it's kind of ingrained, and I think it helps my coverage because I live it. I don't just kind of parachute in. What stands out, New York One opposed to the other stations is, you know, some of them live in Westchester or Connecticut or wherever they live, and they work for the station. They come into Manhattan to the studio, and then they get sent out by the assignment desk on a story. So they sort of like parachute into Crown Heights, and then they do a story, and then they go back home, and they have no real connection to anybody or any, you know, or anything in the borough. And so I think it changes the reporting.